This video introduces the audio feedback options in the infrared neurofeedback with breathing application. Using audio feedback allows you to train without looking at the screen, so you can use the application during eyes closed meditation or mindfulness practice, for example. There are three kinds of audio feedback: MIDI, breathing tone, and threshold. The controls for audio feedback are found at the bottom of the application's main window. Each of the three has an on-off button and a volume slider, and you can choose which parameter to base the feedback on, for example breathing rate or infrared temperature. Threshold-based feedback involves configuring the thresholds using these controls. Let's start with threshold-based feedback. The idea of this feedback is that whenever the feedback parameter crosses a threshold, a sound is triggered, for example a bell sound. The value of using the threshold is that the feedback is generally less intrusive, freeing you to focus on your direct experience. The feedback only comes in when you've drifted away from your desired mind-body state. For example, you can set it so that a bell rings whenever your breath goes too fast. In the infrared neurofeedback with breathing application, there are two separate threshold controls, one for infrared temperature and the other for breathing. Let's look at the infrared threshold controls. You can use this threshold, for example, to set a bell to ring whenever your brain energy begins to fall, or more precisely, the rate of change of infrared temperature drops below zero. Then, the graph here is the same as what you see at the right-hand side of the rate of change display in the upper right corner of the application. Green means increasing temperature, red means falling. This bar controls the actual level of the threshold. You can drag it with your mouse to change it. You can set the feedback to sound either when the signal goes above the limit, or below it, or even both or neither using this control. If you select outside, you'll see two bars displayed, and you'll get feedback when the signal goes either above the upper bar or below the lower bar. Selecting off means you can have threshold feedback only for breathing and not for infrared temperature changes. As an example of a typical usage, set the condition to below and then drag the bar to zero. Now the bell will warn you whenever the brain temperature is falling. You can set a sort of delay on the feedback using this control. If I set it to say 2 seconds, that means that the signal must stay below threshold for 2 seconds before the sound comes in. If it crosses the threshold and then goes back again before the 2 seconds is up, then no feedback will sound. This feature allows you to filter out changes of short duration, which you may regard as not really significant. The breathing rate threshold works in a very similar way. Next we'll cover MIDI feedback. Press this button to turn it on. It plays a piano note repeatedly whose pitch varies with your chosen feedback parameter. Use this control to select which parameter to use. Note that changing the selection during processing causes the application to have to restart, so it's best to make your choice before you press play. For example, if I select breathing rate, then the MIDI note plays at the beginning of each breath, and the faster the breathing rate, the higher its pitch. The pitch range corresponds to the breathing rate range that's selected in the long-term display. If I select infrared temperature, the note plays every half second. When the temperature rises, the MIDI note rises in pitch. The pitch range corresponds to the temperature range that's selected in the short-term display. There's an auto-center feature, meaning that when the maximum or minimum pitch is reached, the current temperature is recalibrated to the middle of the pitch range. There are two options that let you use the infrared threshold to precisely control the range of the MIDI feedback. Another option enables you to use the breathing threshold to set up a kind of target. The closer your breathing is to the target, the lower the pitch. Let's move on to breathing tone feedback. This button activates a tone which follows the breath like this. You can see how this feedback is designed to support breath awareness or mindfulness of breathing practice. The pitch varies with the feedback parameter. Again, you can select which parameter using this control. So for example, if I select breathing rate, then the tone goes deeper as the breathing gets slower. As with MIDI feedback, changing the parameter during a session causes the application to have to restart. One of the options is infrared threshold. This option enables you to use the infrared threshold bars to precisely control the range or the scale of the pitch. You need to have selected outside for this to make sense. The upper bar sets the point corresponding to the maximum pitch, and the lower bar sets the minimum. Another option is inverse threshold. This is just the same, only this time the pitch variation is inverted, so that the tone goes deep when the parameter is high. To make this clearer, I'll give you an example of how I like to use this option personally. I make sure I've selected outside as the condition. Then I drag the upper bar to something like 0, and the lower bar can stay about halfway down the scale like this. Now, when my brain energy is steady or increasing, I get a steady low-pitched breath tone. That's because the signal is outside the range defined by the two bars, and I get the minimum pitch. I focus on maintaining a bright, clear awareness of my breath. If I drift off and the infrared temperature begins to drop, then the breath tone starts to rise in pitch. That's a cue for me to sharpen up my awareness. This option allows you to use the breathing rate threshold to set up a kind of target for breathing rate. See the application's user guide for comprehensive details of the audio feedback capabilities.